The Panzer III arrived at the Soviet proving ground like a prize animal that had finally been caught. It came in on a flatbed, nose forward, tracks chained to steel beams, German crosses hastily painted over, with red stars that still failed to make it look friendly. The truck's engine clattered to a stop in a yard full of battered T-34s, KV hulls, and the skeletal remains of foreign machines already dissected down to bare plates. Somewhere behind a line of birch trees outside the fence, snowmelt dripped steadily. The only sound that didn't smell of petrol or hot metal. Men in quilted jackets and grease, stained coveralls gathered around the trailer before the dust had even settled. Tank crews on temporary assignment to the proving ground. Engineers from JBTU and MBT. A colonel with a scarf wrapped so many times around his neck it looked like armor. A sergeant with the look of someone who had spent too much of the last 3 years either in a turret or under one. The Panzer III sat there, squat and self-contained, late 1941, early 1942, depending on which document you believed, had been its prime. On this specimen, the front hull plate was already up, armored to 50 millimeters. The turret front matched it, but the sides of the hull, the turret cheeks, those told a different story, 30 millimeters on the hull, 30 on the turret, with some bolted, on plates like bandages. One of the Soviet engineers walked up close enough to touch the armor. He rapped it with his knuckles, once, twice. The sound was solid, dull, but he knew the numbers. 30 to 50 millimeters on the sides and lower plates. Against the right gun, at the right angle. That wasn't confidence, it was invitation. Paper. The sergeant muttered in Russian, under his breath. Paper on the sides. Behind him, a lieutenant commander from the optics section said nothing. He was looking at the turret, at the commander's cupola with its ring of vision blocks, at the gun sight port by the main armament. To him, this wasn't about paper. It was about glass. The crane hook descended. Chains clinked. The Panther would get its day later. Today was the Panzer III's turn. The flatbed's bed tilted, and, with a shriek of protesting metal, the German tank slid back down, onto the concrete of the Soviet yard. Tracks grinding rust. It was still in one piece. That was what mattered. They bolted on a set of Soviet, made towing shackles. Someone had joked that the Red Army should have a standard set marked for German tanks only, and dragged the Panzer into a hangar where the wind couldn't steal their notes. Inside, under harsh electric light, the German machine looked almost modest. AT-34 sat next to it, taller, its armor plates slabbed at brutal angles, its cast turret like a lump of slag hammered into purpose. The Panzer III, by comparison, seemed neater. Its weld seams were straight, its plates cut precisely. Its turret was a clean geometric shape, where the T-34 looked like it had been born in a foundry that had then gone straight to the front. The Panzer III looked like it had been issued a uniform and told to stand up straight. The Soviet officers circled it once in silence. They had all read about these machines in reports from the first desperate months of the war. They had seen them in the field, sometimes in their sights, sometimes over the next ridge. Now they would see it from the inside. The colonel cleared his throat. "All right, comrades," he said. "First we drive, then we shoot. And in between, we look through everything that can be looked through. I want to know what the German sees, and what he doesn't. And I want to know exactly how much paper is on these sides." They started with the inside. The driver's hatch came up. The hatch hinges operated smoothly, still well grazed. One of the mechanics swung himself down into the front hull, his boot-scuffing German, non-slip flooring. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, then called up. "Everything is in its place," he said. Levers here, pedals nicely spaced. Gear shift where a man's hand expects. Not bad. He squeezed forward, contorting his way into the hull from the front, then up into the fighting compartment. The others joined him through the turret ring, one after another. It was cramped, but not incomprehensible, especially to men who had lived inside T-34s. There were differences, though. Important ones. The Panzer III was built for a 5-man crew driver and bow gunner radio operator in the hull, then in the turret, a commander, a dedicated gunner, and a dedicated loader. 3 men sharing the turret, each with a specific job. The commander had his own cupola, with a ring of vision blocks. The gunner had a clear, crafted sight directly linked to the main gun. The loader had space and racks designed around him. The T-34, by contrast, in its early war versions, crammed 4 men into its hull and turret. The commander and the gunner were often the same man. He would have to acquire the target, lay the gun, fire, and then immediately rush into commanding the tank again. All while wrestling with a sight of modest clarity and a periscope that let him see some things, some of the time. In the Panzer III, the Soviet officers found the bones of a different philosophy. A young Red Army lieutenant dropped into the commander's seat and instinctively reached for the cupola's vision blocks. His hands found the handles as if he'd been born there. He peered through one of the periscopes and sucked in a quick breath. Clear, he said. Very clear. Like looking at a painting, not through a bottle. German optics. Even under late, war shortcut conditions, were still made with a careful eye. The lenses in the Panzer III's periscopes and gun sights turned the outside world into something crisp and definite. Edges were edges, not blurs. Contrast was good even in low light. The Soviet lieutenant had spent the last 2 years looking through TMFD sights and Mk4 periscopes in cramped turrets. They did the job. They could be replaced easily. But this was different. He swung the cupola around, vision block to vision block. Tracing arcs across the hangar. I can see almost everywhere, he said. I don't have to stand up in the hatch to guess what's happening. And I'm not also trying to lay the gun while I do it. Beside him, the gunnery officer leaned into the gunner's position, his eye pressed to the main sight. The Panzer III on their floor had a 5 cm KK-39 LA-60 gun. One of the later, longer, barreled 50mm pieces. Not the stubby earlier variant. The sight mated to it was simple, with stadia marks and range scales etched sharply into glass. The field of view was narrow but bright. The gunnery officer twitched the traverse handwheel, just enough to feel the smoothness of the geared ring. Even unpowered, the turret moved cleanly. He followed one of the T-34s out in the yard, sighting on its turret, then its tracks, then on a barrel stack beyond. It's good, he said simply. Better than ours in clarity. Range scales practical. No unnecessary clutter. If your gunner is decent, he can hit what he sees. The colonel listened, writing notes in a small notebook. Praise, he thought, was a dangerous thing to give the enemy. But you couldn't afford not to tell the truth about what he did well. Hiroti optics, excellent. Crew layout, logical. Command visibility, superior to T-34. Out loud, he said. All right, we've seen what they see. Tomorrow we see how it drives. Then we see how it dies. The next day, under a sky the color of dirty wool, the Panzer III coughed into life. They had serviced the Maybach petrol engine, checked the lubricants, bled the fuel lines, and cursed at more than one German fitting that didn't match Soviet tools. When it finally caught, it did so with a throaty vibration that promised power, but also drank high, octane fuel like a thirsty man. The German tank clanked out into the proving ground, its 40 cm wide tracks leaving a neat twin trail in the thawing earth. A Soviet test driver sat at the controls, a German manual open on his lap that he barely glanced at any more. He'd spent the night learning the shift pattern by heart. He put it through its paces. Forward through the gears, feeling for the bite of each ratio, steering on clutch, brake, then on differential steering, using the preselector as intended, then abusing it the way a line driver in a panic might, across frozen ruts and frozen puddles that would soon be mud, back and forth over a crest until the suspension song was etched into his bones. From outside, the Panzer III looked controlled. It took bumps well. The torsion bar suspension soaked up irregularities, the way German designers had intended. It didn't pitch like some earlier Panzer IIIs had. Its hull and turret stayed relatively stable as it shook over the ground, which explained some of the accuracy German gunners brought to moving engagements. Inside, the driver called his impressions over the intercom. Levers are comfortable, he said. Steering is precise. You don't need the strength of a bear to keep it straight. But, the colonel prompted, leaning in through the hull hatch. The driver grinned, teeth white in his grease, darkened face. But it's a German lady. Fussy. Changed gear badly, and she lets you know. Overheat the oil and the gearbox whines like an old aunt. RT-34. She just shrugs and keeps going. This one will make you pay if you are sloppy. The colonel nodded. That was a theme they were beginning to see. Whereas Soviet designs prioritized brutal simplicity and tolerance for abuse, German tanks often delivered better performance if treated gently and serviced carefully, but suffered more when neglected or mishandled. They ran the Panzer III until its engine temperatures stabilized and its tracks flung off the last of the snow. The driver learned how much throttle to use to crest obstacles without banging the suspension. He practiced tight turns until the steering gear grew hot to the touch. Then they parked it in front of the T-34s and KV hulls again and moved on to the shooting. First, the Germans shooting. It wouldn't be fair to condemn the Panzer III's armor without acknowledging what it could do to someone else's. They drove it out to the gunnery range with its own ammunition freshly unpacked from captured crates. Steel cased 50mm AP rounds, blunt-nosed and businesslike. High explosive shells with delicate fuses that the safety officers eyed, as if they could hear their own funerals ticking. From a prepared firing point, the Panzer III engaged target Hoax downrange, old BT hulls, scrap T-26, plates set up at various angles and thicknesses matching known friendly armor. The German gun didn't disappoint. At 500 meters, 50mm AP punched clean holes through older Soviet light tanks and made a mess of plating meant to represent early T-34 side armor. Against the thick frontal armor of a KV, it struggled. But that was an unfair opponent for a medium tank. The gunnery officer watched the fall of shot and wrote his own notes. Accurate enough, he said. Not a Tiger, but serviceable. With these optics, a good crew could place rounds into our flanks and into our lighter vehicles at ranges where they will not miss many. He underlined something in his notebook. We cannot assume they do not see us. They see well. Then, with the gun still warm, they let it cool. The Panzer III was moved again, this time to a different part of the range. They parked it in a cleared lane, nose toward the prepared firing pits, where Soviet guns already waited. When it was braked and chocked, and the crew had climbed down, the colonel walked out and laid a hand on its side again. "You shot for us," he said quietly to the steel. "Now our guns will shoot at you." The first to fire was the Red Army's old workhorse, the 45mm anti-tank gun. Crews manned the M1937 and the newer M42 like they had 100 times before. Breech open, shell in, breech closed. Sights settled. They had been told what they were shooting at and where. First, the front. The gun commanders aimed at the glacis and the upper hull front at ranges scaled to typical battle distances, 500, 800, 1,000 meters. The 45mm shell struck with a crack that echoed off the range berms. Paint flaked. Dents appeared. Spurts of dust shot from weld seams. At 800 meters, rounds into the upper hull front left marks, sometimes deep gouges, but no full penetrations. The 50mm plate and slope did their work. At 500 meters, with the gun elevated to simulate a flatter trajectory, one shot punched through a thinner, lower plate. Another shattered around a weld, sending spall into the interior space, as later examination would show. The colonel watched through binoculars and noted, front hull not invulnerable, but respectable. Against older 45mm BR-240 AP rounds, especially, it would often hold beyond a few hundred meters. Then they walked the aim sideways. The Panzer III's hull and turret sides, unsloped slabs of 30mm rolled plate on early and mid-war variants, had always looked like a chink in the armor to men who thought in angles. Now they had the chance to prove it. The gun crews relayed. The range was settled at 500 meters. A gust of wind tugged at sleeves. The colonel gave a short nod. Fire. This time, the impact was different. The 45mm shells hit at a slightly oblique angle, like they would in a real side engagement, where the German tank was trying to angle its hull a little. And still, you could see the steel's confidence vanish. A fist-sized plug blew out of the hull side, near the second road wheel. Another shot hit the turret side, centered between the vision port and the mantlet. The sound was a hard, cracking thump, followed by the dull, rattling noise of metal bounced around in a compartment with nowhere to go. When they called a ceasefire and approached, the pattern was obvious. The sides had been perforated in multiple places. Spall streaked the interior. A man standing in the loader's position would have had his legs turned into red mist. A man at the radio would have been torn by fragments from the hull side and the racks. The colonel put his hand over one of the holes. The plate around it was bent inward, reminding him of dented tin. "This," he said, not bothering to keep the satisfaction out of his voice, "is what we like to see." They varied the range. At 600 meters, good penetration still. At 800, the 45mm began to struggle if the angle was generous, but hits at or near 90 degrees still hurt the German tank. The side armor, 30mm thick and sometimes backed by only air, was, at least to Soviet eyes used to thinking in terms of 45mm guns and 14.5mm anti-tank rifles, the definition of paper. Not literally flimsy, not in the shoot with a Mosin and it falls over sense, but weak where Red Army doctrine encouraged the right angle, the right flank, the right ambush. They proved the second part of that equation with the infantry guns. Out came the PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles, those long barreled beasts that had become synonymous with desperate anti-tank defense in 1941 and 1942. Firing 14.5mm armor, piercing rounds with fierce recoil, they had often been cursed by the men who had to lug them. Against newer German heavy tanks, they had lost much of their luster. But against earlier Panzer IIIs and IVs, and especially against side plates, they still had teeth. On the range, the rifle team settled in at absurdly close distances. 100 meters, 75 meters, then 50, for testing. These were distances where a real rifleman would be sweating and praying no one saw him, nestled in a ditch or behind a log. But for the sake of data, they lay prone on a cold, packed earth firing line. They were told to aim where they would in battle, at the lower side plates, at the joints of armor and suspension, at the edges of plates, where stress and manufacturing sometimes left microcracks. Not at the strongest, smoothest sections, but at the places a clever soldier would pick. The 14.5mm shot cracked across the range like someone slamming a door on the sky. The heavy bullet hit with a metallic smack that you could feel in your teeth if you stood close enough. Against 30mm side plates at 90 degrees, at 100 meters, the shot punched its way in, leaving a small but unmistakable hole. Not the broad, plug-blowing wound of a 45mm shell, but a sharp puncture. Behind that hole, Spall crowned the steel's interior face. Anything close would have been torn or stunned. At 75 meters, the effect was more pronounced. At 50 it was, for that small corner of the plate, lethal. Angles mattered. At 30 degrees obliquity, the 14.5mm struggled more. Some rounds deflected, others embedded without full penetration. But the Soviet testers were not looking for a miracle. They were looking for a pattern. Could their infantry, with courage and good angles, threaten the German workhorse medium? The answer, tentatively but confidently, was yes, especially from the side. They mapped the results carefully. On turret sides of similar thickness, hits at 90 degrees at short ranges often went in. On side skirts and storage bins, the rounds flew through into the hole beyond. On the front, though even at close range, 14.5mm fire did little more than chip. When they gathered in the briefing hut afterward, the room smelled of wet wool and paper. Charts were tacked up on the walls. Silhouettes of the Panzer III marked with colored chalk where various weapons had penetrated or failed to do so. Red circles on the side hull and turret. White crosses on the front. The colonel pointed with his pencil. Here, he said, tapping the Panzer III side view. Hull side. 30mm. At ranges under 600 meters, our 45mm can kill him. At closer ranges, 170, 50, our 14.5mm rifles can hurt him. Wheels, side plates, turret ring. You let him show you this and you do not let him leave. His pencil traced along the top of the tank. Roof and engine deck. Fin, if you get a chance from above, buildings, embankments, slopes, you take it. Molotovs, grenades, anything. But realistically, this is the main menu here. He tapped the whole side again. He moved the pencil to the front view. Here. 50mm on the front. Slab, not sloped, but still thick. At normal battle ranges, our 45mm will not reliably penetrate, especially if he angles even a little. Our 76mm will. Our larger guns will. But the infantry rifle, the 45 at long range, no. So what do we do? He let the question hang for a moment. A tanker in the back, his sleeve bearing the guard's badge, answered. We do what we already try to do, Comrade Colonel. We don't meet him head-on if we can help it. We pull him into our guns. We let him pass and hit him from the side. The colonel nodded, satisfied. Exactly. The Germans like to look forward. They like to see well. We respect that. We have seen their optics. We have sat in their commander's cupola. We know he sees more than our own commander sometimes can. So, we do not stand where he is looking. We stand where his glass is weaker and his armor thinner. He turned to another chart, this one a scribbled diagram of a road, a village, a line of advance, gun motor carriage tactics, he said, using the odd English-derived phrase that had crept into some of the doctrine after studying Allied practice. We put our 45s and 76 on trucks, on Komsomolets tractors, on little tanks. We let them move fast to where they are needed. Then we hide them. Let the German's good optics look down the road and see nothing. Let him drive into our flank fire. On the chart, little arrows showed German columns moving into kill zones, where Soviet guns had pre-measured distances and angles. The place where the Panzer III's front faced nothing deadly, but its sides faced several angry barrels. The colonel drew a quick line at a right angle to the German arrow, then another, offset. Ambush geometry, he said. Angles. This tank has taught us that numbers on paper, the thickness here, the firing tables there, are only half the work. The rest is how you put yourself where their advantages are smaller. Later, word of the tests filtered back to units in more informal ways. A sergeant returned to his brigade after a rotation to the proving grounds, and, during a lull, in the fighting around a nameless village, gathered his anti-tank riflemen and gun crews in a ditch. He drew in the mud with a stick. This is their little 3, he said, sketching a box with tracks and a turret. The one that keeps poking its nose into our positions. He drew a thick line across the front. Here, he is stubborn. Our 45 will knock his gun about, hurt the driver, maybe break something if we're lucky. But it's coin toss at range, and he sees you because his glass is good. His commander has his own periscope. His gunner sees well. You shoot, you give away your position, and maybe you only scratch him. He drew a thinner line along the side. Here, he said. He is paper. 30 millimeters. Our 45 will go in at 500, 600 if your aim is good. Our rifles, if you are brave and close, will go in at 100 or less. Hit the lower plate, here, by the second wheel. Hit the turret side. Hit the joint between plates. That's where the metal wants to crack. We saw it. One of the riflemen shifted his PTRD on his shoulder and scowled. So we just let him drive by, he said. Wave at him and wait. Why let him drive into a place where his front means less, the sergeant said calmly. You see him nose forward on the road. You don't waste your only shot on that slab. You wait until he passes the corner of that house, or that stand of trees we marked. Then you hit him as he shows you his side. If you have to, you let the first one pass, and you kill the second, then the third. They will stop. The column will bunch up. Our guns will do the rest. You are not heroes because you shoot first. You are heroes because you shoot where it matters. Back on the proving ground, the engineers also wrote about something else. Not just where to shoot, but how the Panzer III's superior crew layout and optics should change their own expectations. they noted that German tanks, by virtue of better all-around vision from the commander's position and the division of labor in the turret, were less likely to be surprised in the open. A German Panzer III commander could keep his head down and still maintain a reasonable awareness of flanking threats, because his cupola windows gave him a panoramic view. A T-34 commander often had to stand half out of the hatch, in the wind and dust and danger, to command properly, and even then he had less help inside the turret. That meant that ambushes had to be better concealed, that anti-tank guns could not rely on being completely invisible, just because they were low and covered with branches. German optics would pick out muzzle flashes, movement, unnatural shapes. Tankers were warned that just because they could not see a Panzer's commander, it did not mean he could not see them. Respect their vision, the colonel wrote in his final report. Assume that what you can see, they can also see, if they are looking. Our advantage is not that they are blind. It is that they cannot look everywhere at once, especially not behind and to the sides. Our tactics must force them to look forward while danger comes from elsewhere. In practice, that meant more emphasis on combined arms coordination. Infantry to fix German tanks from the front. Anti-tank guns and tank destroyers to hit from flanks. Tanks to exploit once the Panzer IIIs and IVs were engaged. The captured Panzer III had not told them anything radically new. Soviet commanders had dreamed of flanking and envelopment since before the war. But it had given them hard, test-proven numbers to back their instincts. Early side plates in the 30-50 millimeters range meant that, from the right angle, all the cheap and simple weapons in the Red Army's inventory, 45 millimeters guns, built by the thousand, a 14.5 millimeters, rifles fed by brave men in snow and mud, could still play in a fight dominated by bigger calibers. In a war where factories had to supply entire fronts, that mattered. Years later, when the war was over and the proving ground had quieted down, a Panzer III would stand in a museum, its armor patched and painted, its German markings restored for the sake of authenticity. Visitors would walk around it, listening to guides talk about early war blitzkrieg and desert campaigns. They would hear about how the Panzer III had been the backbone of the German Panzerwaffe in 1941 and 1942, how it had roamed across steppes and through villages, fire blazing from its short 37 millimeters and later longer 50 millimeters guns. If they were lucky, they might also hear the quieter story, the one that had been written in notebooks and chalked on range boards back in 1942. That Soviet tankers had climbed into this machine and, for a few days, seen the world as the enemy saw it. That they had been impressed by the clarity of its optics and the logic of its crew layout. That they had mocked its paper, sides with the gallows humor of men who knew they would still have to face it in battle. That the captured Panzer III had helped teach them that a tank's value was not just in its gun or its front armor, but in the balance between what it could see and what it could survive when struck where it was weakest. In that balance, the Panzer III came up short against a Red Army that had learned, the hard way, to treat vision as something to respect and armor, as something to be judged from all directions, not just head-on. On the proving ground, the last act of the Panzer III's Soviet testing had been ignominious and useful at the same time. They had parked it at a slight angle, marked with paint the points where 45 millimeter and 14.5mm shots had gone in. Then they had brought up a pair of self-propelled guns. Gun motor carriages in the lexicon of the manuals, an SU. 76. Essentially a 76.2mm divisional gun on a light tracked chassis, and an SU-122, tossing heavier HE shells. From hull-down positions, moving in short dashes, they had reenacted an ambush. The Su-76 had crept into a firing line that gave it a 60-degree shot into the Panzer's side and opened up, its crew calling out, "Side!" Third plate? As if in battle. The shells had smashed through the already weakened armor and turned the Panzer's interior into a storm of dust and flying metal. The Su-122, lobbing a high explosive round into the front, had simply caved in the lip of the glacis and broken weld seams loose, demonstrating in one violent illustration that armor which might resist a small, fast projectile could still be humbled by a larger blast. In his final sentences of the report, the colonel had written, "Panzer III is a capable medium tank in terms of optics, crew organization, and gunnery. Its front armor, when up armored to 50 mm, presents a significant obstacle to our older anti-tank guns at long range. However, its hull and turret sides, a 30 to 50 mm, are vulnerable to flanking fire from 45 mm anti-tank guns at medium ranges, and to 14.5 mm anti-tank rifles at close ranges. The enemy's advantage in observation and fire control must be acknowledged and countered by tactics that impose unfavorable angles upon him. We must not meet his strengths head-on if we can arrange otherwise. Let him see far in front. We will work around the sides." That, in the end, was the split verdict from the men who had driven, examined, and then shot the captured German machine. Respect the optics, exploit the paper, and in between, build doctrine and survive. Subscribe for more untold stories of WWII.